David, first off, could you give us a sense about how small island states and communities are feeling ahead of these talks and while they're progressing? What's the general atmosphere amongst communities who live in states which we are led to believe are becoming increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change?
Well, Ed, I think in one word, they're very, very nervous. They feel very vulnerable. In the Pacific, we have the 3 lowest countries on Earth out of the lowest 5, with a predicted rise of 1 metre of sea level. This means a loss of life, serious issues. So within the Pacific, there is a sense of urgency, nervousness, and I think a feeling that for Pacific Island countries, the negotiation process needs to accelerate and needs to be better aware of this level of urgency that's facing the small island states in the Pacific.
What realistically can small island states do in a process which is dominated, I guess, by the bigger countries, both the bigger emitters, the bigger economies? What sort of voice do they have? What presence do you feel they have within the talks?
It's very difficult. So if you look at some of the small island states, their delegation might be 1 or 2. Some of the larger developed countries may have 40, 50 delegates. It's not a level playing field. So basically we have to work together as Pacific states, but as part of broader groupings. So as part of the AOSIS, and obviously linked with the G77 and China, which Fiji chairs at the moment. So we have to work together with others. It's difficult to get our voice across, but we are trying to do that. Everyone is vulnerable to climate change, as we saw in the Philippines with Typhoon Hainan, but we particularly feel that sense of vulnerability in the Pacific with our unique characteristics of size, vulnerability, and the clear impacts we can see now of a changing climate linked with natural disasters.
I remember a few months ago that Majuro Airport in the Marshall Islands was, I think the whole capital was briefly swamped by rising waters. I mean, to what extent can some of these small islands adapt, and to what extent is there going to have to be a recognition that people won't be able to live there for too much longer?
Well, that any issues relating to migration, movement of people are incredibly sensitive. Clearly, no one wants to move from their country. This is a worst case scenario, and any decisions relating to that are entirely up to the country or the community. At SPREP, we place our effort on practical adaptation measures. So Majuro Airport, in times of drought, we've actually redesigned that. So that's a catchment area for a water reservoir, so that captures the water. And those types of measures, coupled with education awareness on water conservation, are a key part of our PAC project, the Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change, which is also looking at areas such as food security. How can we develop more salt-tolerant taro species, as one example, and also coastal management, developing of what we call climate-proofed infrastructure, better designed so it can withstand a changing climate and also natural disasters. So at the Marshall Islands, at the Pacific Island Forum, we leaders reinforce the fact that climate change is the major challenge facing the Pacific, that it's a matter of national security. But President Loak of Marshall Islands, what he said was, we're not just standing on the shore waving our hands in distress. We're actually taking practical actions. Many Pacific countries are responding with these adaptation measures. Many Pacific countries are actually moving rapidly to renewable energy. Tokelau in the Pacific gets 100% of its energy from solar sources, for example. So the fact that the Pacific is only contributing 0.03 is not stopping the Pacific from taking the actions. But we're basically looking at a range of responses. We're calling from Pacific Island countries for the international community to recognise the challenges, the vulnerabilities, and the need for that to be reflected in agreements such as the agreement we're working towards in Paris in 2015 and other agreements, including on finance.
You mentioned the Paris Agreement in 2015 and also finance. I guess the third part of those big issues that are being discussed at this conference is the increasingly contentious issue of loss and damage. Some countries appear to be taking this slightly more seriously than others. What would be your message to negotiators taking part in the loss and damage talks? Because many developed countries have drawn a red line and said we're simply not willing to contemplate any form of comprehensive climate compensation scheme. From someone representing an organisation, you know, involved with small island states, what's your message to people discussing that issue and how seriously they should take it?
Well, the message again is one of vulnerability and the fact of livelihoods of Pacific countries are at stake, and a key part of a response to that is through mechanisms such as loss and damage. So we would underline the urgency, the critical nature of the climate challenge linked with natural disasters, and the need for action on this and other areas. So from SPREP and particularly the Pacific Island country members, that's a clear message.